G'day everybody, Danny from Board Game Sanctuary here. Today we're going to be looking at my top 5 favourite tips for teaching a brand new board game. Tip number 1 is all about the gist of the game. Explain to players straight up what the goal of the game is, how they're going to actually win, and really just touch on the main points and concepts of the game. Keep it super simple. The less you explain, the more players are able to digest and mull over the points that you've just emphasized to them by sorting through the most important ideas from the ones that you probably don't need to touch on right now. Players are going to be so much more engaged in the teaching process of a game. Tip number 2 is a complaint that I often hear people say when they're learning a new game, and that is, can we just play the game? And sometimes just letting people touch all the components, play with the toys, much like Lego, people are probably going to really learn the rules a lot more better and commit them to memory if they're experiencing the game by manipulating them at the same time that you're explaining them. When you explain a game, try not to have people just sit there and listen to you. Actually, take them on the journey. Play a mock round where you say, okay, in phase 1, we're all going to be putting our pieces out on these sections of the board. Now everyone do it. And phase 2, we're going to be doing this. This is how we're going to be gathering our points. Let people manipulate the cards and move the tiles around. I know you might have spent a lot of time setting the game up, but you know, games are made to be played with and manipulated with and explored. Let people explore. Just do it. Let them play the game. Tip number 3 is what I like to call the just before method. What I've often found when I'm teaching a really hard and complex game is that I'm often wanting to offload a whole lot of information all at one go to the players at the table, and that can be extremely confusing and overwhelming. So by using the just before method, what you essentially do is just before the next round or the next phase begins, you give those little tiny reminders to the players at the table. So you might say something like, just before we go to the next phase, you get these 3 actions. Just before we finish the round, we need to do these 3 things with the game board. And by adding these little just before reminders, it really adds to the flow of the game, reduces confusion, and kind of allows players to only take in what they need for what they need to do right now. So they can work on their strategy as well as pick up the rules of the game on the go. Tip number 4 is all about preparing players for tricky rules or exceptions to the rules that appear in a game. I like to call this hiding the broccoli. Basically, what you're doing is you're presenting those tricky or niggly rules in a much more thematic way so that players can kind of understand why they're in the game to begin with. And by presenting them to players as kind of really cool twists to the game itself, players are more aptly going to be able to accept those niggly rule exceptions as you teach the game. One of my biggest gripes when it comes to learning a new board game or even teaching a new board game is accessing the rules. And one of the biggest things that board game designers and board game publishers need to include in their games, and if you buy a game that doesn't have one of these, I would suggest going on to Board Game Geek and printing one off that someone else has created, or even creating your own, and that is a player aid. Give each player a player aid that has an overview of all the symbols, a summary of all the rules and the round structures, because oh boy, having a player aid for every single player stops a player from asking, can you please pass me the rule book? What does that symbol mean? Can you check this little rule again for me? Those sorts of questions just slow a game down. It really is something that you kind of have to preempt as well. So it's like when you're the one that's going to be teaching the rules, knowing those little scenarios that come up beforehand is something that you also need to prepare for. Remember, you know, if there's other players who've already played the game, it's really cool to include those players in the teaching process. They can help back you up when it comes to explaining rules that certain people might need explained in a different way. The other thing that I often do is try and find stepping stone games that do things in a similar way. So if I'm teaching a worker placement game, I might teach a gateway worker placement game first and then lead into the more heavier worker placement Euro game. And it is okay to make mistakes. There's so many things that you have to keep track of that making mistakes is part of the natural learning process. And if we don't make mistakes, we never learn. And you know what? It's all part of the fun. Thank you once again for joining me for another Board Game Sanctuary video. If you really like this video, please consider heading over to my Patreon page and supporting me on Patreon. Otherwise, consider giving me a like and subscribe. And if you want to check out some more really cool topics, I have a cool playlist called Talking Sanctuary Blogs. And if you want to see more board game content there, head over to my YouTube page and check it out. This is Danny signing out. I can't wait to see you again next time. Goodbye.